If you're part of the Honest and Open Conversations community, thank you. And if not, now's the time to join us, because this movement only gets stronger with every voice that stands with it. Now, on to today's podcast. Before we talk about physics, before we talk about crash statistics, before we talk about policy, fatigue law, or media narratives, you need to understand why this conversation is personal. I didn't arrive at this topic through research. I arrived at it through life. I grew up around trucks. My dad was a truck driver. I still have extended family in the industry. Friends, acquaintances, people whose lives revolve around moving freight across this country. Some of my earliest memories involve trucks, not as machines, but as a presence. Sitting in the cab as a kid, feeling how big it was, feeling like nothing could touch you. I remember having to hide in the sleeper when the truck was pulled into a weighing station. I remember living on a property where tractors, trucks, paddock bashers, and livestock were normal. Heavy vehicles weren't unusual. They were part of life. And even as a kid, there was this background awareness that trucking wasn't just a job. It carried sacrifice. In the 80s, trucking took fathers away from homes for long periods. That reality stayed with me. It is something I had hoped to study professionally, but universities, with their ideological indoctrination, stopped that path. And I want to be clear about something. Taking fathers out of homes for long periods of time is extremely detrimental to children. This is not limited to trucking. It applies to fly-in, fly-out miners, oil rig workers, and industries that remove parents from homes for extended periods to keep the country running. I understand the requirements of these businesses. I understand the economic necessity. I understand the roles these workers play in keeping Australia going. But here is a question everyone should think about. What is the point of keeping the country going now if in the process we're destroying the next generation? Because fatherless homes are permanently damaging families, and they are permanently damaging children. That is not abstract, that is reality. Sometimes the pressure took more than time. Far too many fathers were permanently taken. Not everyone was cut out for it. Not everyone had the skill base. And the industry didn't always allow people to be perfect because the schedules and the demands were brutal. And the only way to keep up was to use what is commonly known as speed. So the danger wasn't theoretical. It sat around the edges of childhood like a shadow. You didn't fully understand yet. But when public road safety campaigns were confronting, and they were meant to be, the Take a Break Fatigue Kills campaign was one in particular.
Ciao, mate. Okay. See you Monday, John.
Hi.
Hi. How's work?
Oh, full on.
Get me home. I need some sleep.
Oh, I thought we'd go up the lakes tonight.
Are you serious?
Yeah? Yeah, come on, the roads will be deserted.
I'll have to call Mum.
At 2 a.m? She's gonna love you.
Well, I'll call her first thing.
Well, talk to me, man.
No.
Yeah, come on.
No. Pull over if you're tired.
That stuff sticks. But the true weight of it didn't hit me through ads. It hit me through people. I've watched families get torn apart by road trauma. I've seen what loss does. how it changes a house, how it changes a family line, how it changes the way a child sees the world. And I'm going to be direct here because it matters. We lost my older cousin, someone who was like a big brother to me, in a crash involving a truck, minutes from where he was meant to arrive. The official version was that he fell asleep and went into the side of a truck. But within my family and in my own view, there have long been serious doubts about what happened and how it was handled. I believe a bad truck driver was protected and the blame by New South Wales Police was placed on an out-of-towner. I'm not presenting that as a proven fact. I'm telling you what some in the family believe and what I believe and why it shaped me. Because either way, the outcome was real. A real man was gone. A family was wrecked and a little girl lost her hero. So when I talk about responsibility on the road, I'm not talking in abstractions. I understand the consequences of bad decisions in cars and in trucks because I've seen what the aftermath looks like when it isn't a headline. It's your life. At the same time, I grew up with another truth about trucks that most people don't say out loud. Protection. I remember travelling with my mum after my parents split, and her plan on long drives was to stay near the trucks. Because trucks were predictable. Because truck drivers were alert. Because in regional Australia, if something goes wrong, a truckie might be the only person who stops. That stayed with me. The idea that trucks aren't just risk. They're part of the support network on the road too. That understanding deepened when I travelled a long distance in a B-double. Not long out of Newcastle, a car misjudged braking distance and forced heavy braking. The moment changed something in me. You realise truck driving is harder than people think. You see the skill, you see the margin, you see how normal car driver behaviour becomes dangerous when 60 tonnes is involved. Later, I also drove trucks myself. Limited, under instruction, but enough to understand the reality. Medium rigid, some exposure to heavy rigid, with a split gearbox. That driving happened on private land and on public roads. What made my experience unique was loads. Unrestricted water tanks with no internal baffles. In the tank, if the tank was half full, the water moved. The centre of mass shifted, braking and cornering became harder. The vehicle felt alive in a way a car never does. It forced me to think about the things most motorists never consider. Height, clearance, braking distance, load behaviour, and how quickly small mistakes turn into serious outcomes. And once you've experienced that, even briefly, you don't drive around trucks the same way again. You give space, you don't cut in, you stop treating gaps like they're yours by default. There was another realisation that hit me sitting high in a truck cab. And it's uncomfortable, but it matters for road safety. Many drivers believe the inside of their car is private. It isn't. From a truck cab, you see things motorists don't realise are visible. Distractions, phones, eating, arguments, behaviour that has nothing to do with driving, like sex acts. I recall one example clearly. If you know the Newcastle area of New South Wales, you know the Gateshead intersection. I first spotted the woman in question coming down Cardiff Hill on the Pacific Highway at around 80 kilometres an hour. Her behaviour continued all the way to where our paths separated at the Gateshead interchange. We headed towards Charlestown. She continued towards the Newcastle inner city bypass, where the speed limit increases to 90 kilometres, or during peak hour. What was the behaviour? Her business attire skirt was hiked up and she was using a large dildo to reach climax while driving. And it reinforced something truck drivers already know. From the cab, you see far more than people realise. You see behaviour that dramatically increases risk, especially around heavy vehicles. And that is a serious road safety problem. And it happens far more often than people think. What feels like normal driving from inside a car can look like obvious distraction from above. Distractions aren't theoretical when you're managing a vehicle that takes 2 football fields to stop. It becomes immediate, it becomes dangerous, and it reinforces something I learned early. Road safety isn't just about truck drivers. It's about everyone understanding that their behaviour is visible and consequential. Privacy on the road is an illusion, and distractions around heavy vehicles are one of the most underestimated risks we have. Across all of these experiences, family, loss, travel, perspective, driving, a belief formed. Truck drivers aren't perfect. The industry has real problems. Pressure has existed for decades. Capability matters, and good truck drivers carry responsibility most road users never fully appreciate. And they do it inside a system that often demands more than it supports. That matters because the point of honest and open conversations is to have the conversations others avoid. For example, the ABC, who I believe use the trucking industry to push narratives that are deliberately divisive. I, however, choose the trucking industry, warts and all, and the country that depends on it, and how we are heading toward a pressure point. Driver shortages, increasing freight demand, growing system complexity, a widening gap between decision makers and operational reality. And media, narratives that can simplify a complex, high consequential job into a caricature. That's why this episode exists. I want good truck drivers listening to know something clearly. There are people who see what you carry. There are people who respect what you do. And regardless of how successful this podcast becomes, truck drivers will always have a supporter in me and in honest and open conversations. For everyone else, the goal is simple. Understanding, because understanding changes behaviour, and behaviour saves lives. So before we talk about blame, before we talk about policy, before we talk about narrative, we start with the one thing nobody can argue with, physics. Because once you understand the physics, everything else snaps into focus. Let's slow this right down, because this is where the argument either becomes undeniable or it collapses. Under Australian general mass limits, a standard 26-metre B double can legally operate at up to 62.5 tonnes gross mass. Most passenger vehicles weigh between 1.5 and 2 tonnes. So when a B double and a sedan share the same stretch of highway, you're looking at a vehicle that can weigh 30 times more. That difference isn't symbolic, it changes everything. Now, add speed at 100 kilometres an hour, a vehicle travels approximately 27.8 metres per second. That means in 1 second about 28 metres, in 3 seconds about 84 metres, and in 5 seconds about 140 metres. 5 seconds at highway speed is longer than most people intuitively grasp. Now bring in energy, and this is where it becomes precise. Kinetic energy is calculated, as I understand it, as half times mass times velocity squared. At 100 kilometres an hour, 7.8 metres per second, 2,000 kilogram passenger car carries roughly 0.77 megajoules of kinetic energy. A 62,500 kilogram B double carries roughly 24 megajoules. That's about 31 times more energy at the same speed. And because velocity is squared in the equation, energy increases exponentially with speed. Increase speed by 10%, energy rises by roughly 21%. That means small misjudgments do not produce small increases in force. They compound. Now let's move from energy to stopping distance. On a wet road at 100 kilometres an hour, a typical passenger car requires around 122 metres to stop. That is already longer than a football field. Now compare that to a loaded, articulated heavy vehicle. A B double at highway speed can require in the range of 170 to 200 metres plus, depending on load and surface. That's approaching and sometimes even exceeding 2 football fields. And all that assumes immediate reaction, full brake performance, and no downhill gradient. Now add reaction time. At 100 kilometres an hour, 1 second equals nearly 28 metres. If percept decision take just 1.5 seconds, that's over 40 metres travelled before braking even begins. Motorists routinely merge into gaps of 10 to 20 metres because that feels safe in a car. But 20 metres at 100 kilometres an hour is less than 1 second of travel. That gap disappears almost instantly for a heavy vehicle. Now let's go deeper. Passenger cars use hydraulic brake systems. Heavy vehicles use air brake systems. Air brakes are incredibly powerful. They have to be. There is a measurable system lag. It's fractions of a second. But at 100 kilometres an hour, fractions of a second are metres. And metres matter when you already require 2 football fields to stop. Now introduce a downhill gradient. On a 5% downgrade in regional Australia, that increases brake demand, that increases heat. And under sustained load, heat reduces braking efficiency, a phenomenon known as brake fade. Modern systems are vastly improved, but physics still governs heat and mass. Now let's talk stability, because braking isn't the only risk. In articulated combinations, there are 2 catastrophic instability modes drivers are constantly managing. A jackknife. Here is a video of what a jackknife actually looks like. Under heavy braking, the trailer can rotate relative to the prime mover. Once angular momentum develops, control can be lost quickly. That is a jackknife, a rollover.
Rescue mission has unfolded in Western Sydney overnight to free a driver after his truck tipped over. The 25-year-old driver became trapped in the cabin after it rolled at a roundabout in Minchinbury just before 1 a.m. Emergency services were able to free the driver from the wreck before taking him to hospital with minor injuries.
Sharp steering input, especially in high centre of gravity vehicles such as tankers, tippers and livestock carriers, lateral acceleration can exceed rollover thresholds. Rollover is governed by centre of mass height relative to truck width. Add something most motorists have never heard of: rearward amplification. Which means a steering correction that feels moderate in the cab can create amplified force at the back of the combination. So when someone says, why didn't he just swerve? Because swerving 60 tonnes is not the same as swerving 2. A sharp evasive manoeuvre can convert frontal collision into a rollover event affecting multiple lanes. The driver is not choosing between good and bad. He is choosing between constrained outcomes in milliseconds. Brake aggressively, risk jackknife. Steer sharply, risk rollover. Hold the line, attempt to manage 24 megajoules of energy in a controlled path. Now consider spatial awareness. A B double can be around 26 metres long, roughly 5 sedans, nose to tail. It has substantial blind zones, directly in front, along both sides, especially the passenger side, behind the final trailer. You see the signs on the truck. If you can't see the driver's mirrors, the driver likely can't see you. Now place that vehicle in a mixed traffic where surrounding motorists are operating on car logic. That is the environment. When a 2-tonne vehicle collides with a 62-tonne vehicle, survivability is not evenly distributed. Physics distributes force according to mass, which means outcomes are often tragic, even when initiation did not originate with the heavy vehicle. Now imagine carrying this awareness every day, and you're doing it inside a country that depends on you not getting it wrong. Take a moment and think about your day. You wake up, you make coffee, you open the fridge. Milk's there, eggs are there, fruit is there. You check your phone, a package you ordered yesterday is out for delivery. You get in your car, you drive past a service station. Fuel is available. You walk into a supermarket. Shelves are full. Not mostly full, full. You don't think about it because in modern Australia, Availability is assumed. Food is always there. Fuel is always there. Medicine is always there. Construction materials arrive on time. Hospitals operate continuously. This is what we call normal. These are our creature comforts. Here is the uncomfortable truth. None of it happens by accident. None of it happens by magic. None of it happens because the system works. It happens because someone moved it, and most of the time that someone was a truck driver. We live in a country that celebrates visibility. We celebrate sporting champions, musicians, actors, influencers, corporate tycoons, and sometimes that celebration is deserved. But let me ask you something honestly. How many of you know the name of a truck driver? How many of you have ever thanked one? How many of you even know the signal truck drivers use to say thank you on the road? We can name athletes, we can quote performers, we can identify CEOs, but the people who keep the shelves full, the people who keep fuel flowing, the people who ensure hospitals don't run out of oxygen, they are anonymous. And the more essential they are, the more invisible they become. That is not accidental. It's cultural. We ignore infrastructure. And truck drivers are human infrastructure. Now, there is an old line in Australian history. Australia rode on the sheep's back. For generations, wool exports underpin this country's survival. Sheep stations funded infrastructure. Rural production financed cities. The land carried the nation. When historians say Australia rode on the sheep's back, what they mean, the country survived because something real, physical, and unglamorous carried it. The shearer wasn't a celebrity. He was a necessity. Now fast forward, the sheep no longer carries this nation. And we need to be honest about what does. Food does not teleport. Fuel does not materialise. Medicine does not appear by magic. Exports do not leave without transport. The modern Australian economy runs on the ability to move goods across a continent-sized landmass every single day without fail. And overwhelmingly, that movement happens on steel wheels. Australia once rode on the sheep's back. Today, it is carried on the back of heavy vehicles, and the people inside those cabs are the ones holding that weight. We wrote songs about shearers, we carved statues of stockmen, we elevated rural labour into national mythology. But the truck driver, invisible. And because he is always there, we stop seeing him. That is not a small oversight. That is a cultural blind spot. Now let me be clear. I'm not saying truck drivers are saints. I'm not saying they never make mistakes. What I am saying, calmly and deliberately, is this. Truck drivers as a profession carry a level of civic responsibility structurally comparable to first responders and soldiers. First responders run towards emergencies. Soldiers defend national stability. Truck drivers maintain national continuity. The reason I'm doing this podcast is simple. Truck drivers deserve recognition proportional to their responsibility, to the responsibility they carry. When we combine the physics they operate under, the fatality data, the public misunderstandings, the regulatory burden they absorb, and the economic dependency, you begin to see something clearly. They are not an inconvenience on the road. They are one of the load-bearing pillars of modern Australian life. And when a country forgets who carries it, it begins to weaken itself. That's why this conversation matters. There are more trucks on the road now, and that must mean the roads are more dangerous. Let's go back to the 1970s. In 1970, Australia recorded 3,798 road deaths. Our population was roughly half of what it is today. The road fatality rate sat above 30 deaths per 100,000 people. Today, our road fatality rate sits closer to 4 to 5 deaths per 100,000. That is not a marginal improvement. That is a structural transformation. Now think about what happened between 1970 and today. The freight task did not shrink. It expanded dramatically. Mining boomed, agriculture industrialised, containerisation reshaped global trade, Retail centralised into supermarket chains, and logistics replaced warehouse buffers. Heavy vehicles did not disappear. They increased. Longer combinations were introduced. B-doubles became common. Road trains expanded in remote corridors. Freight density increased. And yet, per capita, fatality rates collapsed compared to the 1970s baseline. That forces a serious question. If trucks were inherently destabilising to road safety, why didn't the fatality rates rise with freight growth? Why did it fall? Now, of course, multiple factors improved safety across the entire road system. Seatbelts became mandatory, drink driving enforcement intensified, random breath testing became normalised, vehicle crash engineering improved, road design evolved, emergency trauma medicine advanced. But here's the part that matters. Heavy vehicles operated inside that entire evolution. They were part of the road environment as safety improved. They did not exist outside of it. So the simplistic narrative that the growth of heavy vehicles is synonymous with growing danger does not align neatly with historical evidence. It doesn't mean trucks are harmless. We've already covered that. It means the relationship between freight and growth and road trauma is more complex than the headlines would have you believe. And when you zoom in further, when you stop looking at total fatalities and start looking at crash attribution, the picture becomes even more uncomfortable for the popular narrative. Because in fatal multi-vehicle crashes involving heavy trucks, fault is not assigned to the heavy truck driver in the majority of cases. The truck is often the object collided with. That distinction matters. But let's stay in the 1970s a little longer, because when we compare road safety then and now, we need to be honest about what changed. Inside trucking itself. In 1970, seatbelts were not universally worn. Drink driving enforcement was inconsistent, and random breath testing did not exist nationally. Heavy vehicle braking systems were less advanced. Fatigue law was looser and fragmented. There was no national heavy vehicle regulator. Now move forward 50 years. Modern heavy vehicles operate under mandatory fatigue regimes, work diary requirements, increasing adoption of electronic work diaries, speed limiting systems, random roadside inspections, and drug and alcohol testing regimes, mass compliance audits, onboard telematics, and inward and outward facing camera systems in many fleets. Drug and alcohol enforcement intensified from the 1980s onwards. Chain of responsibility laws fundamentally changed liability. Responsibility no longer sat solely with the driver. It extended to schedulers, loaders, operators, executives, and directors, at least in theory. Companies now face substantial penalties if systemic safety failures are identified. Vehicle kilometres increased, the population increased, the economy increased, fatality rates fell. That doesn't mean everything is perfect. It means the story is more complex than trucks are more dangerous now. It also raises a serious policy question. When regulation intensifies during a period in which fatality rates are already declining, are we regulating proportionately to measurable risk or proportionally to public perception of risk? This is not an accusation, it's a governance question. What does the Australian crash data actually say about trucks? Start with the headline number. Across Australia, crashes involving heavy trucks account for roughly 15 to 20% of all road fatalities in a typical year. So trucks are clearly present in the fatal crash picture. The second question is, who dies? About half of those killed are occupants of passenger vehicles, not the truck. Truck drivers make up a much smaller share of deaths in those incidents. That aligns directly with the physics we discussed earlier. Now we move to the most misunderstood question. Who caused the crash? Research cited by the National Truck Accident Research Centre consistently report that in fatal crashes involving a truck and another vehicle, the other vehicle is identified as the at-fault party in roughly 78 to 85% of cases. That does not mean truck drivers are never responsible. It does mean, however, the common assumption that truck size equals truck fault is wrong. So what actually happens in these fatal crashes? Again, the pattern is remarkably consistent. Light vehicles crossing the centre line into the path of an oncoming truck. Failure to give way at intersections, overtaking misjudgments on regional highways, rear-end collisions where a smaller vehicle strikes a truck. These are interaction failures. They occur most often on regional roads, where high speeds, long distances, fatigue exposure, and mixed traffic combine, and this alone means local councils, state governments, and the federal government should be held to account for poor substandard roads. Only an idiot who doesn't have a clue on the trucking industry or the country's economy would suggest lowering speed limits on country roads instead of bringing those roads up to an acceptable standard. Now flip the lens. What kills truck drivers? When truck drivers die, the pattern changes. Truck drivers' fatalities are more strongly associated with single vehicle events. Lane departure, run-off road crashes, a rollover, loss of control, often on curves or during avoidance manoeuvres. These are not the same crash profiles as truck-car fatalities. These are control loss events, and they are where fatigue, road design, load dynamics, and driver capability intersect. That brings us to something rarely discussed properly, the skills question, capability. Australia does not publish reliable crash statistics broken down by driver ethnicity or skill attainment, and it does not publish fatal crash splits by transmission type. The reason I raise this is simple. From my own observations and experiences on the road over the past several years, I believe there is a growing skills problem in parts of the trucking industry. We are seeing foreign drivers entering the industry operating some of the most dangerous vehicles on our roads without the same depth of training, experience, or capability that traditionally existed in the industry. In many cases, drivers are entering large fleet operations through simplified licensing pathways, shorter training pipelines, and vehicles that reduce technical barriers, including automatic transmissions that remove the need to master complex gear systems. Technology itself is not the problem. Standards are. If licensing becomes easier, if training becomes shorter, if experience requirements shrink, and if communication barriers exist in a high-risk environment, then capability gaps emerge. And when capability gaps exist in heavy vehicles, the consequences are not small. This is not about where someone comes from. It is about whether the system is producing drivers with the skill level required for the responsibility they carry. Whether intentional or not, I believe governments across much of the Western world are moving in this direction, and that is a serious safety question. The following clips illustrate the concerns I'm raising.
A deadly crash here at Florida getting national attention, including from the White House. Surveillance video shows a trucker making an illegal U-turn, and that's when a minivan slammed into it, killing 3 people inside.
So if we're serious about safety, we focus on variables that are actually measurable. The strongest evidence points towards experience, training, exposure, and operating environment. Heavy vehicle safety research consistently highlights risk factors such as newly licensed heavy vehicle drivers, limited supervised experience on high mass combinations, a rapid transition into articulated vehicles, operating in an unfamiliar regional freight corridors, and work complexity increasing faster than training depth. In other words, the system has become more complex faster than capability development, and when capability gaps meet high mass physics, the consequences are severe. So when you step back and look at the full picture, the structure becomes clearer. Roughly 1 in 5 road deaths involve a truck. About half of those killed are people in smaller vehicles. In fatal truck-car crashes, the initiating error is most often attributed to the other vehicle. And the emerging safety pressure is not simply fatigue or regulation or enforcement. It is capability. That is where the conversation needs to move if the goal is prevention rather than blame. Media coverage does more than report events. It shapes interpretation, and trucking has increasingly become a cultural story, not just a safety story. Media framing influences where the public looks for causes, and once a narrative becomes culturally anchored, it can shift policy attention, even when crash data points elsewhere. It means story selection matters, which is why understanding media framing is not about dismissing journalism. It's about recognizing that narrative gravity exists, and it shapes how responsibility is understood long before crash investigators publish their findings. Now we get to the part most Australians have never gamed out properly, because people talk about trucks like they're optional, like they're a nuisance on the highway, like they're just traffic. But Australia is not a small, dense European country with 5 freight options stacked on top of each other. Australia is a continent with long distances, low density, centralised warehousing, and a supply chain designed around road freight being available every day. So here's the thought experiment. If every truck disappears tomorrow, or even just stops, what happens? Not eventually. What happens first? What breaks first? Which cities feel it first? And what does the economy lose per week? Let's do it properly. What share of freight is actually on roads? People assume rail would just take over. It won't. National stats show that in 2023-2024, Australia moved roughly 249 billion tonne by road, 448 billion tonne by rail, 88 billion tonne by coastal shipping, and 0.2 billion by air freight. That looks like rail is bigger overall, and it is in raw tonnage. It is because bulk export chains dominate iron ore and coal. But here's the catch that matters for your daily life. Rail and coastal shipping do not do last-minute distribution. Rail moves bulk between very specific points, like the Hunter Valley and Newcastle Port. Coastal shipping moves along limited sea lanes. Air freight is tiny. The thing that keeps supermarkets full, pharmacies stocked, construction running, fuel moving, hospitals supplied, online shopping delivered, and warehouses turning over, is road freight. Trucks. So if the trucks stop, the question isn't, can rail replace it? The question is, can Australia replace last-minute distribution at all? And the answer is no. Not at speed, not at scale, not national. Let's use a clean baseline. ABS reports. Australia's nominal GDP for the September quarter 2025 was $717 plus billion in one quarter. A quarter is roughly 13 weeks. So average nominal GDP per week is about 55 billion. Now, does truck stop mean 100% of GDP disappears? No, but it doesn't need to, because the first week isn't about GDP stopping completely. It's about supply chains failing, which forces production shutdowns. And if trucking stops nationwide, a large slice of the economic activity becomes impaired immediately. Even a 20% hit to weekly GDP is catastrophic. 20% of 55 billion equals a loss of 11 billion a week. At 30%, you're at a loss of 16.5 billion. And that's before you price in panic buying, shutdown cascades, and export bottlenecks. Compare this to during COVID, Australia took a historic hit, but it wasn't a total freight stop. ABS data shows the June 2020 quarter saw GDP of minus 6.8%. That's the comparison that matters. COVID disrupted demand, labour, and some logistics, but freight still moved. If trucks stop, you're not talking about a hit of minus 6.8% in the quarter. You're talking about system failures that create immediate shortages, immediate shutdowns, and cascading economic paralysis. What breaks first? The timeline people can actually picture. Now we go hour by hour, day by day. The first 24 hours, nothing looks broken yet because the shelves are stocked from yesterday's deliveries. But behind the scenes, distribution centres stop turning over. Supermarket replenishment routes stop. Construction deliveries stop. Parcel network stop. And the system instantly starts eating its buffers. The public doesn't see the failure yet. They see the warning signs. Out of stock. Delivery delayed. Order cancelled. 24 to 72 hours in. This is where psychology hits. Once people notice gaps, behaviours change. And once behaviour changes, the system gets punched in the face. Supermarkets get stripped of high turnover items first. Bread, milk, meat, baby formula, toilet paper, the usual pattern. Pharmacies start rationing common meds. Service stations start seeing queues because people hear fuel deliveries aren't coming. And this is where trucks are optional fantasy dies, because the modern retail model is built on rapid replenishment, not on warehouse full of stock sitting for weeks. Day 3 to day 7. Now it becomes structural. Hospitals burn through high-use consumables faster than people realise. Aged care facilities start tightening supplies. Food distribution becomes triage. Building sites stop. Manufacturing lines that depend on daily inputs pause. Refrigerated supply chains become a serious issue. And here's the kicker. Fuel becomes a limiter of everything else. Now that doesn't mean the whole country runs out on day 29. It means the system is not designed for long disruptions. And if trucks are stopped, the distribution of fuel within Australia becomes the immediate choke point. Because even if fuel exists in storage somewhere, you still have to move it. So you get a brutal feedback loop. No trucks, no fuel. Essential services lose mobility. Recovery becomes harder. Which cities collapse first? And what collapse actually means? Let's be precise. Collapse here doesn't mean Mad Max overnight. It means essential normality fails first. The places that feel it first are the ones with least redundancy and the highest import reliance for day-to-day essentials. So the order usually goes like this. 1. Remote and regional communities first, because their entire model is truck supplied. They don't have alternative freight options on standby. And once a regional town's supermarket misses a few delivery cycles, the shelves don't run low. They drop out. 2. Perth, because it's geographically isolated from the eastern states by a long and fragile land corridor. Even when sea freight exists, the metropolitan distribution still depends on trucks once it lands. 3. Darwin, because supply chains into the top end are long and the buffer is thinner. Again, ships and planes don't fix last mile distribution. 4. Hobart, because Tasmania still relies heavily on shipping across Bass Strait. But once freight lands, it still becomes a trucking task. The eastern capitals, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, they don't collapse last because they're invincible. They collapse later because they have more distribution centres. more redundancy, more supplier density, more routes. But they also have bigger populations. So once panic behaviour starts, those buffers burn fast. So the message is, the cities don't fail in order of importance. They fail in order of logistics redundancy. Why just use rail fails as a response? This is the part I want to say bluntly. Rail is brilliant for what it's built for, but it's not a substitute for road freight in a sudden disruption, because you can't instantly add locomotive crews, paths, terminals, and last-minute networks. Rail doesn't reach most final destinations, and switching modes requires infrastructure that has to exist before the crisis. So rail is not plan B. Rail is its own system. Trucking is its connective tissue. Now I want to take a step back. This isn't emotional, it's structural. 60 tonnes, 2 football fields to stop. That is the reality moving beside you on the highway. Heavy vehicles appear in the fatality picture. They're not the simple cause that the public narrative suggests. So the story becomes simple, even when reality isn't. And when simple stories drive complex policy, we miss where risk actually lives. This episode wasn't about defending trucking. It was about clarity. Because trucks are not traffic. They are infrastructure. Food moves, fuel moves, medicine moves, everything moves. And behind that movement are people managing enormous consequences every minute, every day in public space. Truck drivers are one of the load-bearing pillars, and pillars are invisible right up until the moment they fail. So next time you see a truck, don't see an obstacle, see responsibility. Drive like you understand what you're sharing the road with. That is where safety starts. That is where respect starts. That is where fewer families get broken. If you got value from this, share it. Send it to a mate. Send it to the person who tailgates trucks. Send it to the person who thinks cutting in is harmless. Because it's these bad drivers that cause most of the truck car fatalities. But it's the truck drivers who have to live with the consequences of their actions. Let me leave you with a few questions to think about. Have you ever complained about truck noise? If you have, normally complaining about the exhaust or air brakes, an engineering feat that saves lives. Have you ever stopped on the side of the highway where there is a large opening and a steep incline for any reason other than a real emergency? If yes, you're lucky your truck's brakes didn't fail, or else you'd be dead. Have you ever forgotten to fill out paperwork in the moment and done it later or the next day? I have. As a truck driver, that decision or mistake is at best hundreds of dollars in fines, and at worst, you're in prison and your livelihood is gone, even if you've done nothing wrong. That is because of bureaucrats who think they are dictators, who always overstep their mark to wield power. This is honest and open conversations, unfiltered, unrestricted, unapologetic. The fight for truth isn't over. It's just getting started. I want to thank every single one of you, our listeners, our followers, and especially our members. Your support is the reason this show exists. This platform was built for people like you, people who still believe in truth, courage, and in having the hard conversations that matter.